All right, so this is Art131 with Wyndham Graves, and I have Laura Whatley here with me. Laura, if you'd introduce yourself and give us a little bit of history about you and about what we're going to talk about today.
Okay. Hi, I'm Laura Whatley. I'm a associate professor of art history at Auburn University Montgomery, and it has been years since I've had the opportunity to teach an art appreciation class, so I'm excited. I'm currently teaching women in the arts, so that might give you a sense as to where my mind has been of late. And I've definitely been thinking about artists that I usually don't get to think a lot about. I'm a medievalist by training, and so, spending time really thinking about someone like Georgia O'Keeffe is kind of a fun exercise for me. So I want to talk about women in the history of art. There's certainly some women in the art appreciation textbooks, but sometimes I'm not sure the discussion of them in those textbooks is very good. So I thought we might talk about women, trying to figure out where the women are.
Yeah, that's a really good thing to do, and it does pose a problem in art appreciation classes when the few examples we get are specifically there because they're women, not because they're important in some other way.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a little frustrating.
It's just like, oh, let's just squeeze them in where we can, but not really contextualize them in the same way that we might do other artists in the book. Yeah.
And just so everybody has an idea of your background, you said you're a medievalist. What time period would that be covering?
So I work on mostly Gothic art, so 12th, 13th, 14th century material. Now, I will say when it comes to the Middle Ages, I do work a lot on women, women's patronage, those kinds of topics. So I'm always kind of interested in what women are up to. But yeah, as a medievalist, to kind of be able to teach a class that there's a lot of focus on sort of the modern and contemporary it's challenging, but it's also a lot of fun.
Yeah, definitely. Um, yeah.
It's sort of like you, Wyndham, teaching art appreciation
Yes.
as a designer,
Yeah.
because I have to say there's not a lot of design represented in those textbooks either.
No,
So
and the design that is in there is special.
yeah.
Yep.
So I think we're kind of stuck with these tools. I guess they're tools. I don't know, but we're kind of stuck with them. We have to figure out how to make the best of it.
Textbooks. Yeah, I guess textbooks are tools.
Technically.
Technically, they're tools. So, would you like to start in a subject oriented way, or do you want to start old and work your way to new, or start new and work our way back? What would be best?
I mean, I guess we could just start with a question.
Okay.
That's usually how I start my class. Um, and I will give you a sense of how my students respond to this question.
All right.
I don't expect you necessarily to have all the answers. Um, so in 1970, an art historian who is usually considered like the first feminist art historian, she wrote this article called, it has a very kind of charged title, Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists?
Mm-hmm.
So what do you think about that question? Do you like that question? I don't like the question, but I know why she's asking it. Why have there been no great women artists?
Yeah, and it's one of those questions that's interesting because depending on who's asking it, it's a different kind of judgy.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And it's a question that I think usually leads to, well, one big response from students, which is there have been great women artists.
Mm-hmm.
Usually they'll immediately kind of call out, here's a photo, an image for you. Couple of images. Can you see these images,
Yes,
Wyndham?
yes, I can. I'm going to try to put those in the video. If they don't get in the video, then I'll at least have links for them.
Yeah. So the first thing that, I say this, I'm like, okay, guys, so why have there been no great women artists? According to Linda Nochlin, you've just read this article, but they don't really talk about the article. Why have there been no great women artists? And the
Mm-hmm.
first thing they say is, well, there have been. And most of them, if they've taken an art history survey course or art appreciation, they'll say, what about Artemisia Gentileschi?
Yeah.
She's a woman and she's great, right? She like ticks those two boxes.
Yep.
So they what the first instinct, right, is to sort of pull women out of history and sort of say, hey, there are great women artists.
Hmm.
And this is something that I think it's a bit of a trap, but it's a trap that we all fall into and kind of love. I love falling into this trap because I love talking about these quote unquote great women artists from history. So then it kind of opens up a nice discussion about why Artemisia Gentileschi is great. I don't know,
Hmm.
Wyndham, do you think she's great?
Yes.
Yes. Why do you think she's great?
I don't know. I just dig her stuff. Like
It's
it's such a good representation of the time period, and it doesn't matter. I don't know. I don't know why. That's a good question.
I think her gender, the fact that she was a woman, when you're looking at the work,
It's kind
that
of
is not always
irrelevant. Yeah.
it's not always beside the point, but it can be.
Yeah.
So I have two works by Artemisia on the screen. Artemisia was a Italian Baroque painter. Usually, when we think of Artemisia, we'll think of other artists like Caravaggio and Bernini. The Baroque is right. It's that moment in Italy where it's all about the drama. It's all
Hmm.
about the intensity, that kind of light, the spotlighting. So I've got two works, one of which
It's
is
very
actually
theatrical.
which I think is why people are so drawn to it.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah, we see
whether
that.
you're,
We see that bottom image in class.
do you, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that's kind of the one of the
Oh yeah, that's
quintessential Baroque
her one.
paintings. Um, because I think no matter who you are, what your religion is, you can look at these paintings and you feel them, right? You kind of
Hmm.
experience them in the sensory way. So I've got two works here that I'm sharing. The top one is actually a self-portrait. It's an allegorical self-portrait, but that's Artemisia Gentileschi as La Pittura, or as the painter.
Hmm.
And then down below we have, the very famous work, Judith, the biblical heroine, beheading Holofernes.
Yep.
So she is a great painter. But, thinking about how it is that she herself in 17th century Italy navigated a career in fine art as a woman, I mean, I think that's really where things get interesting. Um, you know, really before, I'm going to say the late 19th, 20th century, if women wanted to be artists, I'm going to sort of say with a capital A, right?
Yeah.
Professional artists, they had to have a connection.
Yeah.
In particular, their father or one of the male members of their family had to be a painter, had to be an artist with a workshop, and had to be willing to train their daughter in the art of painting. And so I think with Gentileschi, she is great, but her experience is kind of exceptional. It's very unusual. Um, but she had her father, Orazio Gentileschi, who saw her aptitude for fine art, saw her aptitude for painting, and made sure she got the training that she needed. And even then, navigating her career was very, very tricky.
So now,
And I think a lot of,
just as a
sorry.
question, how would she have gone about that? Would she have representation that was male, or did she represent herself in the sale and showing of her work?
I think a little bit of both. I think early in her career, her father played a pretty active role again, both in her training and in her development as an artist. But I think at the end of the day, she went out and she was able to secure patrons on her own. And she worked certainly for some of the most important patrons in Florence and Rome. So, in that regard, again, she's this kind of exceptional figure who was able to navigate a career in her own right. Because I think she was so talented.
Yeah, and I
um,
guess even things that we take kind of for granted today, like the acquisition of art making materials, would have been incredibly difficult
yeah,
for anybody outside of the field, much less a woman who can't really navigate in public and navigate professionally.
yeah,
Um, you can't just go
yeah.
down to Michael's and pick up a set of paint.
No, no. And again, there's certainly still going to be limitations in terms of their training. And that's certainly
Hmm.
something that Linda Nochlin talks about in that 1970 article, right?
Mm-hmm.
That, you know, someone like Artemisia Gentileschi or Sofonisba Anguissola, they were lucky in that their family was in the arts or connected to the arts and supported their development and training. But even then, there's going to be limitations,
Mm-hmm.
certainly in terms of access to, say, life drawing.
Yes.
And that's one of the big things that women are unable to participate in, unable to engage in. Now,
And
there is a lot of
And now, just to be
scholarship.
clear, when we get into life drawing, a lot of that is wrapped up in religion and women's place and things like that. So I just want to be clear that the women we're talking about are mainly European women, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, we're not going to get into a lot of the other areas because this is already complicated enough.
Right. The focus here and the focus, it's certainly sort of on that Western European tradition,
Yeah.
and really starting in the Renaissance, and sort of moving forward from there. So life drawing and the practice of life drawing which is essentially drawing from life, right?
Yeah.
Specifically drawing from life, the nude figure.
Mm-hmm.
And it is interesting, even when it comes to important male artists, they were able to practice life drawing, but for the longest time only of men. So women weren't even allowed to come into a studio, disrobe, and pose nude for the purpose of education. Which, I always think that's very, very interesting. I've just posted on the screen a painting inside the French neoclassical artist Jacques-Louis David's studio. And on one side of the painting, you kind of see a male nude posed, and on the other side, you have this sort of group of artists, all male, of course, sort of drawing the figure from life.
Mm-hmm.
So I think thinking about the Western tradition, the Renaissance, the Baroque, sort of through the 18th and 19th century, this was probably viewed as the cornerstone of fine arts education.
Mm-hmm.
Life drawing. And so as a woman, if you don't have access, if you're essentially prohibited from life drawing, there's just this big gap, right? This big kind of lacuna in your training, in your education,
Mm-hmm.
which again I think is really interesting. One of my favorite images is it's this life drawing class. There we go. It's this life drawing class of the Royal Academy of Painting of London.
Mm-hmm.
This is by the artist Johann Zoffany. Now, at this point in time, so here you can kind of see there's the nude and all of these individuals. Some of these guys aren't even sketching. I don't know what they're up to in this room here. But we've got all
They're
of
just
these
hanging
men,
out.
I know, they're just hanging out. They're just sort of part of this process.
That's a lot of people. Like,
Oh, the Royal Academy was sort of massive by the end of the 18th, early 19th century. Lots of members, all men. Now, at this point, there were actually 2 women who were members
mm-hmm.
of the Royal Academy of London. Can you find them? Can you see them? They're certainly not hanging out in this room with all these,
No, I
all
don't.
these
Yeah.
male artists.
Oh, I figured that they were like hiding somewhere in the background, but no, they're not even.
Their portraits, Wyndham, are hanging
Up on the wall. This is the effigy
wall.
one. Oh God.
So we have
It's so
Mary
bad.
Moser and Angelica Kaufman,
Yep.
who were members. They were full members of the Academy.
But they're not allowed to
But
come hang out.
they could not come. They could not study the male nude from life. They could not draw the male nude from life. So I think this is just a sort of great representation of just how restrictive that was. So even when women are allowed into the club, as it were,
Yeah.
even when they're brought in, they're able to be full members of the academies of painting, of art. They're still
They still can't
sort of
participate.
their education is still being sidelined.
And now to get around that, would they be drawing from sculpture, or would they be doing master copies, or and for the I guess the same question goes for before it was okay for men to draw from the female nude. Would they be pulling those from Greek and Roman sculpture, or where would they be getting that information from, or would they just be making it up?
No, you are absolutely. I mean, think about sort of thinking about the Renaissance in Italy.
Mm-hmm.
What did they not have a shortage of?
Yeah.
Classical sculpture,
Yep.
Greek sculpture,
Copies and
Roman sculpture,
copies and copies.
everyone had some kind of sense of the Aphrodite of Knidos, right? The sort of first
Yep.
nude representation of the goddess. So they could certainly work from classical sculpture. And again, starting in the Renaissance, the classical sort of reigned supreme.
Mm-hmm.
Some artists, thinking about someone like Michelangelo,
Mm-hmm.
he just studied from the male body and would add breasts.
Yes.
He's sort of very famous, right, for these very athletic,
Incredibly ripped
muscular
women.
Oh
Yeah.
my gosh, these ripped women. It's because he knew he was more than happy to study the male form and then kind of
Yes.
adapt the male form to the female form, which, for those of you out there who like to draw, I do not recommend this.
No.
I think it leads. I mean, again, who doesn't love Michelangelo? But it was certainly an interesting choice.
It's definitely got a style.
Yeah. But the classical the classical is always there. And then, yes, absolutely. When we get to the Baroque, when we get to the 18th, 19th century, then you do have the option of copying the old masters.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that women absolutely did. And even, sort of looking at the Zoffany print with poor little Angelica Kaufman and Mary Moser up in the corner there, you can see the classical sculpture on the back wall.
Mm-hmm.
So they would have a kind of teaching collection, right? They would have this collection of sculpture that could be used for study. Those aren't just sort of tchotchkes for still life, right? Those are things that would be used as part of the training. Yeah. So that's kind of the first thing.
So just for historical point in time, when would the switch for men to be able to draw from the female nude have happened, and then when would women have been allowed into that same room?
That's a really good question. So we know
even just approximately is fine.
Certainly by the 19th century. So around the time, a little bit after the Zoffany print, we do start to have images of. I wish I could pull it up right now. Let me try to find it for you.
No, don't worry about it.
Images of the Royal Academy where we start to have female nudes being portrayed in life drawing classes. As for women, when women are able to start working from life drawing, what's really maybe the irony here, it's probably around the time in which realism starts to go out the window.
Yeah, so
right? Where
late 19th, early 20th century for most people?
Late 19th, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Where we start to have that push, that movement towards I'm sort of thinking Impressionism here.
Mm-hmm.
There's certainly a lot of the French Impressionist women artists who they paint a lot of nude, sort of women bathing, women and their children bathing.
Yeah.
I think you've sort of Mary Cassatt and Bertha Morisot paintings.
But now those would have been in a more private situation, right? That would not have been in a public forum, kind of like the one that we've been referencing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think for Linda Nochlin, sort of thinking about her article about institutions and women's education and why it limits them in a way that doesn't allow them to be great, which is basically the idea, right?
Yeah.
She really is talking about these sort of formal institutions like the academies, the Royal Academies in Paris, the Royal Academy in London, the academies in Italy. Those are the ones that are really restricting women's access.
Yeah.
To all of the aspects, the components, the ingredients of training that the men are able to engage in. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the other thing that students will, the other thing we start to think about with this question of women artists and why there have been no great women artists, it really actually comes down to value systems and the way we evaluate and value or define what is great.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the things that Nochlin talks about is, well, maybe people just didn't view a feminine style as great. And I kind of hate this. Linda, everyone hates this. And it doesn't really
everyone hates the idea of feminine style, or
Well, just that
the
there
fact
is
that
a
it gets devalued.
maybe both. But I guess there's this. Okay, so this idea, right, that if you're a woman and you have
Mm-hmm.
ladies' hands,
Mm-hmm.
your work will automatically, inherently be feminine. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, I think that yeah, that's definitely an issue. And then there's some people that actually are really for that as well.
Yes.
Um,
Yes. And it was
some of the
what's really
Gorilla Girl
interesting.
stuff. Some of oh, what's her face? Judy Chicago, right?
Oh, Judy Chicago. Yeah,
She's super about feminine stuff is fine, and if it's feminine, then that's cool because I made it.
exactly. Or it was made by a woman, so it should be feminine. It should be discernible.
Mm-hmm.
So it's this idea that the feminine just hasn't been, or what we might discern as being feminine in a work by a woman, hasn't been valued in the same way as what we would, I suppose, classify as masculine
Mm-hmm.
men. I mean, I think this sets up a kind of problematic binary that sometimes works, but sometimes it doesn't. So I've just put up on the screen two Rococo paintings. um,
Yeah, those are pretty
one of
serious too.
yeah, one of these paintings is by Fragonard. Fragonard was kind of I think probably the most well-known, quintessential Rococo painter. It dates 1769. The other painting is by Elizabeth Vigée Lebrun, so a woman painter. A woman
Mm-hmm.
painter who wasn't just a woman, but this is a woman who was the official painter to Marie Antoinette, of all people. And it dates 1782. Can you tell which one is by the man and which one is by the woman? I mean, it's
I
just
can
guess.
guess, but
50-50.
I
She got a
think I'm
50-50
wrong.
shot.
Like I actually think that the very thin-waisted one with the pink sash is the male painter, and the actually what we would consider the less traditionally attractive one strikes me as the female painter. But I'm not sure
You
as to why I know
well,
that.
you're wrong.
Oh no!
And don't worry, because when I do this to my students, about 70% of them are I think they overthink it and they're just wrong.
Yeah, I think that's probably it. Is that I was overthinking it, and being like, well, this is what a guy would be looking at for like the female form and stuff like that.
But what I think about interesting about that is you're thinking about the way that the women are represented and not necessarily
Yep.
the style.
Oh
Like,
yeah.
because it's Rococo. And Rococo is, by definition, feminine or effeminate. It's frilly, it's ruffly, it's soft, it's about pinks and blues. It's hard to sort of look at these two works and say, oh, well, that's by
Yeah,
the hand of a woman,
that's
and that's
feminine and
by the
that's
hand.
masculine because the whole playing field is what we would now call feminine.
Exactly. Exactly. So, what is a feminine style? Is that even a useful way to think about women artists? I I think Elizabeth Vigée Lebrun would sort of say, I was a painter of the times, right? I was a
Mm-hmm.
painter of the day. And that's not to suggest that she didn't produce paintings that were very much about a woman's experience. She's got these sort of groundbreaking portraits of her and her daughter, for example. Even the portraits she painted of Marie Antoinette were pretty groundbreaking for their
Mm-hmm.
time. But her hand, her style, was it feminine because she was a woman, or was it feminine because she was working in the Rococo idiom? And I think
Yep.
it's because she was working as a Rococo painter.
Yep. I would
So,
agree.
and what's
Before we
interesting
move on
is,
from
oh,
her, why would Marie Antoinette have chosen her as her painter? Like, what was the reasoning? What was the importance? Was there importance, or did she just like her? Or did she like her work? What was going on?
so it, this is a kind of a funny story.
That's what we like.
It was actually Marie Antoinette's mother. who
Oh.
became a big fan um, of V.G. Lebrun. So, as the story goes, Marie Antoinette's mother had commissioned, after Marie Antoinette left Austria and moved to the French court, her mother kept commissioning these portraits of her daughter. She wanted paintings in her home of her daughter
Mm-hmm.
that looked like her daughter. And we know that her mother had a sort of private space in the house, so she wanted some more casual paintings of Marie Antoinette, not the sort of formal state portraits.
Mm-hmm.
And it was only Elizabeth V.G. Lebrun sent paintings of Marie Antoinette to her mother that actually looked like Marie Antoinette. So her mother sort of approved of Elizabeth V.G. Lebrun. And I also think Elizabeth V.G. Lebrun made a lot of sense as a painter working for Marie Antoinette, because Marie Antoinette was not loved
No.
by her people, by the people of France. And one of the reasons she wasn't loved is because she was viewed, well, first of all, it took her a long time to conceive an heir, right? A long time to conceive a child. And
Mm-hmm.
then she wasn't viewed as maternal, not as kind of maternal in terms of her children or maternal in terms of the state, the people of France.
Mm-hmm.
And Elizabeth V.G. Lebrun was a great kind of, she was almost like a PR woman, right? She kind of came in and painted these sort of lovely, accessible, and tender images of Marie Antoinette, oftentimes with her children. So it was a good fit.
Yeah, that's so interesting that it's like it was a secondary choice. It wasn't Marie Antoinette's choice, but her mother coming in and saying, "Hey, maybe this person."
Yeah. Marie Antoinette's mother was rich in power, and she had painters sending her all kinds of images of her daughter, but it was really only Elizabeth V.G. Lebrun that sent her paintings that she kind of said actually looked and felt like her daughter.
Yeah, that's really great. That's really interesting.
Not the idea of what her daughter should look
Should
like
look
in
like,
painting.
especially as a regent.
Exactly. As a
Yeah.
queen,
Yep.
right? There's certain social, cultural mores that must be reflected. But her mom just wanted paintings that she could hang in sort of her sort of private room off her bedroom and sort of spend time with her. They didn't have FaceTime, right? They didn't have
Yep.
Skype. They didn't have
You didn't have a
so she wanted,
photograph of your kids in your wallet. You had.
exactly, that wasn't possible. But that's kind of essentially what her mom wanted. She wanted truthful images of Marie Antoinette, and Elizabeth V.G. Lebrun could give her those,
And
which is kind of
now, why do you think that Lebrun was in such a position to make these truthful images? Do you think that she just got lucky and happened to be what her mom was looking for, or was there something about her not having everything wrapped up in the professionalism of it that allowed her to be a little bit closer to the truth?
I mean, I think, and this is my opinion, so
That's fine.
I'll start with that. I think with Elizabeth V.G. Lebrun, as a paint, and this would, I guess, go for all court painters, right? Anyone going
Mm-hmm.
to a royal court, you eat, drink, and sleep the court life.
Mm-hmm.
You are around your subject and their family all the time. So there is, again, talking about access, right? She would have had a lot of just extremely prolonged access to Marie Antoinette. So I think it would have given her, I think, maybe more empathy towards her subject, more
Mm-hmm.
insight into her subject. I do think maybe the fact that, again, Elizabeth V.G. Lebrun was a mother herself. She kind of she did have that ability to understand something more significant about what Marie Antoinette's mother was wanting and what Marie Antoinette herself was wanting out of these paintings, these portraits. And V.G. Lebrun certainly got into hot water from time to time. Some of her portraits of Marie are they're very casual, far too casual for an image of a queen.
And I was just
And
about to ask that. You said that she had all this access, and I'm wondering, and you can probably tell me, um, whether her being a woman allowed some of the social mores of constant contact to fall away, and allowed her to actually spend more time in more situations than a male artist would be able to. Kind of like we think of women of that time period always having female servants.
And companions,
Yeah, and
yeah.
companions, yeah.
All the ladies and right, all the sort of. I think absolutely, and we know that Marie Antoinette was someone who surrounded herself with women. There's even accusations thrown about that they were all, lesbians, right? Sort of hiding
Yeah.
out in sort of private places within the context of the Palace of Versailles. But I do think in this case, yeah, that the fact that Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun was a woman and not, say, Fragonard,
Hmm.
it did give her maybe not more access, but just a different kind of access to the Queen, to Marie Antoinette.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, just imagine that especially for that time period, that would make all the difference in the world for getting that sort of more homey, honest interpretation of someone.
Yeah. She would have certainly seen Marie Antoinette with her wig off.
Yeah.
As it right, kind of
There weren't any paintings of that, though, right?
no.
Okay, good.
Yeah. Not that I can think
Oh,
of.
gosh.
I suppose I could be wrong about that, but not that I can think of.
Okay.
But certainly images of Marie Antoinette wearing clothing that was viewed as kind of scandalous for a portrait, sort of day
Hmm.
dresses. There's the famous painting where she's wearing this sort of thin, white, English chemise, right? Just this kind
Hmm.
of light, airy dress that one would wear while out milking cows and things. And of course, Marie Antoinette did go out and milk cows and things. So
Yeah.
again, I think Vigée-Lebrun, her paintings of Marie Antoinette might be the most truthful that we have of any monarch,
That's
which
really
again
interesting. Yeah.
makes them really fun to look at, makes them to study.
Well, and talk about a great artist. I mean, just even if you look at greatness of just being in the right place at the right time, I mean, that's greatness right there. Just the ability to say that those are the most honest portraits of any like pre-photography monarch that we have is that's crazy.
Yeah. And what's nice with like Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun, unlike other artists, sort of later artists to come, artists like Georgia O'Keeffe even, is I think people of the day, people at the time, viewed her work as great and not despite the fact that she was a woman,
Yeah, not
right? They were
great
just,
for a woman. They're just great.
they're just great.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. But
Well,
yeah, that the sort of feminine style. Well, yeah, they're feminine because they're it's all rococo.
yeah, that's such an interesting thing. That was her style like that because of the period, or did her style, if you believe in the feminine style, did it just line up with the time period so well?
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So I think always looking at work from within their own context
Yeah.
is the
But
first step. It's the first thing we must do. And these kinds of ideas certainly were haunting me as I approached modernism in my class. Because I think when we hit modernism with a capital M,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
Um, there's a whole catalog of issues that kind of come to the surface. So we hit this point where women technically, not technically, actually have access to education,
And just to be
right?
clear, and just for everybody listening, everybody starts modernism at a different place. Where do you want to start modernism?
I usually started at the end of the 19th century,
Okay.
but at the same time, I sort of think about I think about the art critic Clement Greenberg,
Hmm.
who would pretty much start it with Picasso, right?
Yeah.
um, so the early 20th century. And here I've got my load a picture for you guys for
Hmm.
you. So for me, this is modernism. For
Yeah.
Clement Greenberg, right? For these critics, for these first individuals who sort of came out and said, "Okay, this is what modern art is." I think about sort of the men on the screen here.
Yeah.
And I definitely picked these pictures intentionally because they also just say something about what these critics believed made a great modernist painter.
The great man
They're
thinking hard by himself,
yes,
looking
the
into the
great,
distance.
oh my gosh, the great white middle class, upper middle class man who's thinking really hard, staring off into space, Can you identify these guys?
There's Picasso. There is the guy on the top left Rauschenberg? No,
No.
no. And then there's Pollock in the center top,
Pollock in the center with a cigarette, and you can see the drip paintings behind
and
him.
who is the guy in the bottom left?
Matisse.
Really? I guess I've never seen a picture of him. Because I was looking at the
He's
paintings behind him, and I was like, I don't know who that is.
he would be so frustrated right now that you could recognize Picasso and not
Oh,
him,
I bet.
right?
Yeah, yeah.
Because they were big competitors. So just above Matisse is Willem de Kooning,
Okay. All right.
and then Pollock, and then Robert Motherwell.
Yeah.
And I've been
No.
thinking a lot about Robert Motherwell just because I've been thinking a lot about Helen Frankenthaler, who is married to.
Mm-hmm.
And then just below Pollock is Marston Hurley.
Okay.
So, again, I always put all these pictures of female artists up, and it's kind of nice. Most of my students can't identify them. So I'm like, okay, good.
Well, I think the only reason I can recognize Pollock is from that movie that was made about his life. That was quite crazy, but he looks so much
with
like
Ed
what's his
Harris.
face. Yeah, he looks so much like Ed Harris.
What the casting of that movie
Oh,
is
fantastic.
is perfection. At this point, there's been like what 8 different actors, including Anthony Hopkins, who have played Picasso.
Yeah.
So it's all he kind of blurs together with a lot of those actors as well.
He's pretty
But these
recognizable,
are,
though.
yeah, I think so too.
Yeah.
He's distinct looking. But I think these are, when we think about modernism, these are the artists, their work, their processes, their styles that really defined what modern art was. Certainly in Europe, and then again here in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
So I was just kind of like, what about women and modernism?
Mm-hmm.
So women are now able to go to New York. They're going to Paris. They can go. They can train.
Well, they can go outside and buy stuff by themselves.
They can go out and buy their pigments.
Yep.
Um, so where do they fit in? And one of the things that emerged very quickly is to me, or kind of happened as I started to think about this, was they're there. They're just usually thought about in relation to these men.
Yeah. They're a
So
contemporary of one of these men. They were in
they're
that same vein. Yeah.
they're painting in the style of Picasso. For Pete's sakes, the critics talked about Lee Krasner, Jackson Pollock's wife, who was a painter, as taking Jackson's drip paintings and cleaning them, tidying them up. So the language, the way that we sort of talk about women modernists, it's gendered, and and again we kind of go back to this idea of a feminine style, a feminine hand, and so it really led me to think more about Georgia O'Keeffe than I have ever thought about Georgia O'Keeffe.
You don't sound super excited about that.
I love Georgia O'Keeffe, but I actually feel kind of bad that I didn't give her the thought that she deserved years ago.
Yeah.
I've taught this course a number of times, and this is the first time, and I think some of my students, they got fired up when we talked about Georgia O'Keeffe, and it kind of brought new dimension to how I think about her, sort of through how my students were thinking about her.
Mm-hmm.
So Georgia O'Keeffe is a painter, is an artist who was very active. She kind of comes onto the scene 1914, 1915, 1916. And I know, Wyndham, you were surprised at how early.
Yeah, I thought it was 20 years after that.
No, so she's there. She is at the forefront of modern painting in America. I think she kind of defines what that is in some regard.
Yeah.
And yet that's not really how work has traditionally been framed.
No, I've always heard it framed as kind of, actually to a certain extent, as out of time. Like it's always represented as part of feminist art, and because of that, it doesn't get slotted in the timeline. And
Exactly.
so then all you have to go on is, well, what does that look like? And to me, that looks like stuff from the 50s. Um,
Yeah. Not
and
just stuff from the 50s, it all just looks like vaginas.
well, that too,
Sorry.
yeah.
It's all it's all about the feminine
Yeah,
and feminism in
yeah.
some regard. But of course, Georgia O'Keeffe sort of famously, when asked if she was a feminist, Georgia O'Keeffe famously said no.
Yeah.
And of course, she's from the, she was lit, she's
Yeah,
sort of generation. I mean, I guess she could have been she probably was a first wave feminist. I think
yeah.
she believed in women's rights. But we get to the 1970s, and women like Linda Nochlin, who's writing this "Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists"
Well,
article.
and sorry, just to stop and define terms really quick. First wave feminism being suffrage, right?
Yes,
Yeah. Okay.
rights to vote.
Yeah.
Those sort of
Rights to own property. Yeah.
the first big organizations of women sort of fighting for their basic right,
Mm-hmm.
political, civil
Yeah.
rights.
Just to
Second wave,
exist outside of the associated male.
the system, yeah, the
Yeah.
patriarchal systems, yeah, exactly. And then so the second wave feminist, which is kind of late 1960s, 1970s, they latch on to Georgia O'Keeffe in some regards,
Mm-hmm.
and one could argue that they don't serve her work any better than the men um, who she was being exhibited alongside the critics who were writing in the 1920s and 30s about her work.
Mm-hmm.
And what's really interesting is they all kind of say this stuff about her work, and it's all stuff that she herself disagreed with.
Really? Could you throw out some examples there?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know who Alfred Stieglitz is, right? You like
Mm-hmm.
photography, blank photography.
Yep.
Oh, there he is.
Yep.
So Alfred Stieglitz
Gotta love that
is,
mustache.
oh my God, I love the mustache. And I love this. I chose this picture of Alfred Stieglitz, Georgia O'Keeffe, intentionally, just because I think it does say something about the dynamic of the relationship, certainly early on. So Alfred Stieglitz, he was a big proponent of modernism in America, right? He felt like American art was kind of stagnant. He wanted photography to be considered a fine art.
Mm-hmm.
So in that regard, he does a lot for art in America. He opened up a gallery in New York called the 291 Gallery, and he received, I think through a mutual friend, Anita Pulitzer, I believe, he received some drawings by Georgia O'Keeffe, I think 1915, 1916. So he gets these drawings. He looks at these drawings. You're actually seeing one of the drawings. They're great. They're simple. They're charcoal drawings.
Mm-hmm.
They're abstractions, so they're not real. This is not realism. This is, again, kind of the way that Georgia O'Keeffe likes nature, utilizes nature, and then kind of plays with those forms in her. Stieglitz was kind of blown away by these drawings, these charcoals. He was excited by the originality of it all.
Mm-hmm.
And he included 10 of these drawings in a big group show that he did in 1916 at his gallery.
Mm-hmm.
So I think Stieglitz is someone who, right from the start, sort of recognized Georgia O'Keeffe's talent, her vision, her sort of innovative approach to process and image making. And he would go on to ultimately give her solo exhibitions. Now, I think one of the things that he does...
So these were solo exhibitions in New York, and this would have been in the late teens, early 20s?
Yep. So they kind of built this professional relationship. They also had a personal relationship. Perhaps even more well-known are the photographs that he did of Georgia O'Keeffe.
Yeah.
Have you seen these?
I think I've seen that one. And I think I've seen another one. That's
he
further away, yeah.
With just her hands. He also has sort of full nudes.
I think that's what I've seen.
So it's kind of interesting. So between 1919 and 1920, Stieglitz sort of obsessively photographed Georgia O'Keeffe. And at this point, he'd shown some of her work. He was putting her name out there. He was putting her on the map as an artist, or as a woman artist at least. And then he did a big exhibition of his photographs of Georgia O'Keeffe.
And we should also explain that in 1919, 1920, obsessively photographing somebody was much different than obsessively photographing somebody today.
Yes. Yes.
it would be much closer in cost and difficulty to obsessively drawing or painting somebody continuously.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Absolutely. So I think, I mean, each of these photographs is they're each a work of art. At least that's certainly how Stieglitz would have thought about them,
Yes.
in terms of how the subject is posed, the cropping, the dark room work that went into these photographs. But you have to kind of imagine Wyndham walking into the 291 gallery in like 1920, having some sense of this artist, Georgia O'Keeffe, and then being surrounded by all of these photographs of her by a man who was her lover.
Mm-hmm.
They're sensual.
Yeah,
They're
it's interesting because they are, and I'm looking at a few other ones, and they are, but they're not traditional.
no,
Yeah, they're not like a traditional nude, and I think that especially for that time period, they would have been all the more shocking for it.
I think so. I think so.
They're
And
much
so I
more
think,
real, actually, much like our
yeah,
Marie Antoinette thing. They're very real.
we f- we feel like he's telling us something important about this woman, right? He's
Mm-hmm.
unveiling her, unmasking not her body, but something more internal.
Yeah.
Again, I've looked at these for a long time, over and over again, and I can't think of Georgia O'Keeffe without thinking of these photographs by Stieglitz.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in some regards, that's really going to be important when artists and critics start to look at Georgia O'Keeffe's work.
Yeah.
They're not going to be able to unsee or erase the image of her in Stieglitz's photographs.
Yeah.
So I think it's interesting. There's a lot of sort of feminist scholarship about O'Keeffe, and this idea that O'Keeffe and her work, so both O'Keeffe and her work, her paintings, her drawings, are in some ways bound to the male gaze, right? Her
Uh-huh.
body and her art have been eroticized from a male perspective. And this really is rooted in Alfred Stieglitz and the way that he
Really?
exhibits, the way he photographs her, and then the way that he talks about. So let me throw them up. We're gonna go there.
All right. We can do that.
Her flower paintings.
Yep. I think everybody can at least picture the idea of one of those in their head.
And I think, it's so funny. My students read this article, and then I'll ask them about the flower paintings, and still half of them, oh, it's like their female genitalia.
Yeah.
They look at these, and I'm not just picking on my students here. I'll pick on the critics. I'll pick on other artists. I'll pick
Yeah.
on feminists like Linda Nochlin and Judy Chicago. They look at these works and they see exactly what Stieglitz promoted about these works.
Yeah.
That these are expressions of not just woman's sexuality, but Georgia O'Keeffe's sexuality.
Yeah.
That these are overtly, right, feminine.
Mm-hmm.
And that's coming from Linda Nochlin.
Well, and I think
And so
that comes from Judy Chicago's stuff too, of the whole like this
definitely.
is yeah.
The dinner party.
Uh-huh.
So we have this situation where Georgia O'Keeffe's art, really from the beginning, is being valued within male conceived ideas of what it is about and what it should be about.
Well, and I wonder to a certain extent how much that dichotomy actually helped make her work more interesting to more people. Of if you have one person saying this is what it is, and then another person says no, that's not what it is, well, that's automatically more interesting than something that everybody agrees on.
That's true. And it worked, I think, as a strategy
Mm-hmm.
to sell her work, to put her on the map. I think it was Stieglitz's strategy worked. God, should I say it? Barf. Sex sells. Ugh,
Yeah.
sorry, but but there's something to that. And so I think when Stieglitz
But I think
marketed these works,
that it's not just that sex sells. This is this sort of it's the mix.
Yeah.
If she agreed that that's what these were about, nobody would have cared.
I suppose that's true. And
Yeah.
I care now because she disagreed
Yep.
vehemently about this.
Exactly. And even at that time, I'm willing to bet that a lot of the interest in it was that sort of, I hate to say coy, but
Yeah.
almost like that sort of feeling towards the sexuality of the pieces.
I think that's a fair point. I think there's absolutely I think you're accurate
Yeah.
in that regard. Um, it's
And it's so weird because I just do not find any of these things beyond like surface level sexual or erotic. They're so weird.
I mean, if you were to show a botanist
Yeah.
these paintings, they would say, "Oh, that's the anatomy of a flower."
Yep.
I think these are more akin to botanical illustrations than images of the female body.
Well, and her work has always struck me as almost like Geiger-esque,
Yeah.
like H.R. Geiger's stuff, where it is sexualized, but it's so removed and so extremified
Yeah, yeah.
that it loses its initial intent or drive. I guess I don't know.
I agree, which is maybe why people just continue to promote these so forcefully as erotic or sensual or anatomical.
Mm-hmm.
So, sort of lest we forget,
Yeah.
lest we actually look at these works and start to see flowers. Because,
Yeah.
yeah, you're right. What's interesting about that?
Yeah.
I mean, of course, for George O'Keeffe, that was what was interesting.
Yeah.
And she felt discriminated against, right? She hated the way that others interpreted her works.
So, but
Um,
how
you know,
did she feel about Stieglitz throwing her stuff out there like that?
what's interesting is most of her sort of negative reactions about these interpretations of her work come much later.
Ah.
So
Ah.
at the time, I think she let it happen.
Yeah.
Her work was on the rise, her career was on the rise. Her relationship with Stieglitz was fiery for a while there.
Yeah.
And it's really later where she comes back and sort of says, "Oh, I'm so sick of people talking about my flower paintings as being sexual or as somehow representing my sexuality." She says they're paintings that reflect how I see the world, right? How
Mm-hmm.
I see things, how I look at flowers. She really wanted to sort of magnify flowers towards a kind of abstraction to force our engagement. So she's like, hey, you can see whatever you want, I suppose, but these works are really about my personal experience, the intensity with which I look at nature, with which I look at plants. And I just wanted to give just a little bit of that to the viewer.
Mm-hmm.
So according to Georgia O'Keeffe, these are flowers.
Well, and just a
Take it or leave it.
question, and I think this is an important one for women in art. Did she not feel comfortable about coming down on people for sexualizing her paintings until much later? Did she ever say anything about, I finally feel powerful enough to like take care of this, or was it never mentioned?
What I think is interesting is that her most powerful reactions against these interpretations are reactions against feminist art historians and feminist artists of the late 1960s and 1970s.
And so her reactions
Because I
against
think,
those people versus the initial reaction that feels very much the same.
yes,
Why one and not the other? I have
and
no idea.
because no, it's an interesting question, and there is a paradox, I think, here. With Georgia O'Keeffe, I think by the time she hit the 1960s, I think she did believe that she should be viewed simply as an artist and not a woman artist, right?
Ah,
And
yes.
she felt like once again she was being kind of pigeonholed as by her what was sort of her gender, right?
Mm-hmm.
And feminist art historians were kind of revitalizing those interpretations of her work. as being feminine, as being representative of female sexuality. And I think at that point, she just was kind of tired of being pigeonholed. And she's like, why am I now being pigeonholed by women?
Yeah.
It's almost this kind of, she has this kind of famous quote. She has a lot of famous quotes, but she has this kind of famous quote, something along the lines of, men did a lot for my career. I'm still kind of waiting for women to do something for my career, like women to do something useful for me.
Interesting. Now, do you think that just folds right into that whole thing of the feminist art historians having issues with them more than the initial male gaze?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
I think so. Because I think at the end of the day, again, she had a personal relationship with Stieglitz.
Well, it also sounds like she had much more control in that relationship than she did with the later art historian. She could dictate the terms.
I think that's fair to say. And I think with Stieglitz, Stieglitz was very powerful in the art world. But he did have, I think, deep and sincere respect for Georgia O'Keeffe, for her work, for what she was able to produce. And Georgia O'Keeffe would have known that. So I think there would have been a kind of confidence in that partnership.
Yeah, she would have understood that the sensationalization of her work had nothing to do with him disrespecting the work.
Exactly. Whereas, in 1970, when and asks if she'll be part of this women artists exhibition, Georgia O'Keeffe kind of throws her hands up and says, "No, I'm an artist."
Yeah.
She says no. She declines the offer.
Yeah.
Which I think is very, very interesting. Now it is funny, and I just two more kind of, I guess, big thoughts here.
Oh yeah, go. We have time.
Now, and then I love these paintings. These are works also produced in the 1920s.
Mm-hmm.
So she's making her flower paintings. The flower paintings are being exhibited. Everyone's seeing sexuality and eroticism. She was also producing cityscapes.
Mm-hmm.
These were not as well received.
No, I can imagine that.
I love them.
Yeah, they're actually really good examples of like early Art Deco.
They are.
Yeah.
And again, just like with the flower paintings, right? She's trying to see. She was living in New York City at this time. She didn't connect so much to New York City. We can kind of understand why after being in New York, she flees to New Mexico and kind of lives out the rest of her life there. She felt very oppressed and very restricted. She felt like it was a very ominous place. And so once again, like with the flower painting, she's trying to help us see the city through.
Well, I'm sorry, where was she before New York?
So she was in New York, and then she goes to New Mexico.
Yeah. And
then she's kind of lured back to New York by Alfred Stieglitz and her relationship with Stieglitz.
Okay, but she was born and grew up in New York.
Oh my gosh, where is Georgia?
I'll look her up. Don't worry about it. I got it.
I know that she went to. She was at the Art Student League. I think she's from Chicago. It's one of those weird facts that I should remember, and it just is out of my brain. Because I feel like she went to the Art Institute of Chicago, and then she went to New York.
She was born in Sun Prairie, Wisconsin.
Oh, she's born in the prairie.
Yep.
Yeah, so she does go to the Art Institute for school, and then does end up in New York, and she's at the Art Student League. Yeah, so 1905 to 1906, she's Art Institute of Chicago, so she is a Midwesterner.
Yep. All right. That makes a lot of sense as to why she would find New York oppressive.
Yeah, she's from those big open states, and again, New Mexico, with all those big plateaux, you can kind of understand why this list would also appeal to her.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, these cityscapes weren't as well received, and basically what she thinks is because they couldn't be sexualized.
Yeah, I can see that.
That first of all, she was kind of critiqued
mm-hmm.
because she was a woman painting a city.
Yeah.
A city is masculine. It's okay for you to paint.
Yeah, but as soon as you start painting architecture, that's a no-no.
Yeah, that's a no-no because that's a masculine thing. That's for the hands of men. So I do think it's interesting. It kind of proves the point that Stieglitz was perhaps right in the way that he promoted and framed her flower paintings, because her cityscapes were certainly not as well regarded or received. In fact, they were criticized for being too masculine for a woman painter.
Yeah, I actually just posted one in there when I was looking up her information. This is from 1912 at the Rotunda University of Virginia. And looking at that versus those cityscapes, you can just draw that very straight line.
Yeah. I like the way that she paints architecture.
Yeah, I think it's great, especially. I very much
the coldness of it. Yeah.
Well, she captures the coldness of it, but in the list of, or in the three in a line at the bottom there, the framing at the top edges by other buildings is really interesting and something not generally done in cityscape architecture of hugging it in, of making it have that sort of overarching feel to it.
It's all that, sort of.
The top edge of the frame is not simply open to the sky.
No, the buildings kind of come back and they cut back in. Yeah, we're trapped.
Yep, you're trapped in the city. You're stuck.
Trapped in the city. Well, that's what I have. That's what I've been thinking about.
All right, cool. I have a few questions.
Like I said, Georgia O'Keeffe, I've been thinking a lot about Georgia O'Keeffe and kind of where she fits into this bigger picture. Because once you hit feminist art and feminism, again, I feel like someone like Georgia O'Keeffe, she herself gets lost again.
Yeah, she gets lost in the other half.
Yeah, she gets lost in the history of women. I mean, it's like where do these modernist women fit in? It's very tricky.
Well, and again, like I said at the beginning, like she is presented as such a feminist artist that she gets pulled out of the timeline to the point where somebody who has to do this stuff still is not really aware of where she drops in the set.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think, like again, you being unclear that how early she was painting. Again, she is at the front of American modernism. She's boots on the ground. She's producing work. Yep. She's studied with Dow, right? Who was one of these big guys who said form and color and flat, no more realism. She was right there, and yet she gets kind of plucked out and used wherever people want to use her, and it's so problematic. And I think all of these early modernist women artists, they do actually just want to be part of, like you said, the timeline.
Yeah, they don't want to be separated out. They want to be in the timeline with everybody else.
Yeah, they don't want to be outsiders.
Yeah,
they don't want to be the other, right? They want to try to find a way to fit in. And I think you could probably make a similar case for, the Black artists of the Harlem Renaissance.
Oh yes.
Sort of artists working within those. Again, they don't want to be pulled out of the timeline. They want to be integrated.
Well, and also that comes back to a big issue we have with textbooks and teaching this stuff. I mean, you're a teacher of art history, and I teach art appreciation sometimes, and like just thinking of how Asian art is represented and how completely separate and unaligned it is with everything else, and how unintegrated it all is.
You take a Western survey course, and all you know about Japanese art or Japanese printmaking is that Van Gogh liked it.
Yeah, and the British like their their tea sets.
They do. They love the tea sets, and they design wallpaper. It is very problematic. So I think our role is to always try to, as best we can, with the tools
bring
available
that stuff back,
to put it back in, or at least give the artist the last word, if that's at all possible. And again, that's one of the fun things about working modern and contemporary art, is that we can let the artist have the last word.
Yep. Yeah, I like that quote. That's a great one. The quote is, "The men like to put me down as the best woman painter. I think I'm one of the best painters." And that's by Georgia O'Keeffe.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for having me.
No, I have questions for you. You're not allowed to leave yet.
Oh no, know more. Okay, what do you
Yeah.
got?
So one of the things I was reading, because I crash coursed myself on this to talk about this and not sound like a complete moron. But there were a few things that I want to talk to you about and kind of see what your opinions on them were. And one of the big things that I kept hitting was that concept that we briefly talked about when we looked at the photographs of those male artists, is that sort of like romantic genius flavored thing that we have in art. And since you had that reaction, I'll just let you go from there.
Well,
and how that really messes with women in art, specifically to this conversation.
I mean, I think this is just so deeply. I'm gonna throw my own discipline under the bus. I mean, this is really
Go for it.
the issue of art history, right? Is how deeply embedded in art history this is. I'm someone who gets to teach the Italian Renaissance. I'm someone who actually I did my master's thesis on Giorgio Vasari.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm someone who has done deep dives into the first writers of what we could call art history. And I'm thinking of Giorgio Vasari's lives of the most eminent painters, sculptors, and architects in Italy.
Mm-hmm.
And at the middle, the sort of apex of his book are the lives of Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael, and Michelangelo, the sort of Ninja Turtles, right?
Yeah, of course.
And what really defines them, what sets them apart? Well, he calls Michelangelo Il Divino.
So great.
The divine.
Yeah.
So when it comes to evaluating, he's using a system that is based in a kind of mystical, God-given talent. And what's really interesting, he's writing in the 16th century,
Mm-hmm.
and that myth gets picked up. It might still be picked up today. I don't know. I mean, again, I think
it totally is.
Are trying to challenge these things, but there has to be some reason why someone like Jeff Koons is an artist, right?
Yeah. I mean, you can look at it. Actually, probably more people would have more experience with that sort of attitude in pop culture. And things like actors, actresses, musicians that are just given just incredible free reign.
Because they have something magical.
Yes.
And what's really interesting about all of this magic is that it doesn't seem to be something that women can have historically.
Well, and if you look in especially Western religions, that's what you get. You have masculine divinity, and the female divinity is only by relation or by process.
She's literally the vessel.
Yeah, the process. Yeah.
She's the container for the divine.
Yeah. And we're talking about Mary for everybody.
Not that we want to get too theological here.
No, please.
The myth of the genius is something. Yeah, it starts. I would say it sort of starts in the 16th century in terms of the visual arts, in terms of sculpture and painting. So
you don't think that went back to classical times?
Oh well. All right. If you want to get real, not necessarily related to artistic production.
Okay, interesting.
But related to just civilization.
Yeah.
Because is it Plato who refers to women as unfinished? They're unfinished men.
Oh God, I don't remember that.
So I mean, again, to be described as an unfinished anything, it's certainly going to make your place in society, in culture, very clear.
Yes.
And those are ideas that are picked up again in the Renaissance. Because again, they start reading.
Because they start reading all that and looking at all that.
And Aristotle. Yeah, I mean, they go back to those texts. And so those ideas become embedded again in just social, cultural thinking.
Yeah, it's amazing what people will go back and pick up when they just like the sound of it.
Yeah. And so if you think about someone like Picasso, I mean, he kind of propagated the myth of genius, right?
Yep.
He tells us, he's like, I learned how to draw like Raphael when kid. I spent the rest of my life forgetting how to draw like Raphael.
Yeah. Yeah, we talk a lot in class about these. None of these artists are humble people.
but artistic genius kind of eschews humility,
Yeah,
right? You
right.
know, these men don't apologize
Oh
for anything.
no, for literally for anything.
And I think, one of the things that I talk a lot with to my students when we start looking at, we look at a lot of work by men in my class
Mm,
because men represent women.
yeah,
The female figure, right? The female nude is kind of one of the quintessential subjects in the whole history of art. And so from very early on, we literally have male artists, these genius artists, defining, framing, telling us what women are,
yeah, and
and
even
how
and
they,
that even runs well into popular culture too. Of
gosh,
all of the way
yes.
we define women in the modern sense is through not even the male gaze in general, but a very few specific men who defined and specified it.
Yeah. Well, it's this kind of it's just yeah, it's this kind of like nebulous group of men, but they're going to probably be white, upper middle class, or sort of elite men. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
this kind
very
of
wealthy
set
men who are designing the outfits for these people, and the body has to fit the outfit, not the other way around.
who are running all of the companies and the studios that are making the
Yep.
commercials that we watch every day. Um, Absolutely. So again, I think the myth genius is propagated, and in some regards I think it is a mechanism of it's just one more mechanism of control,
Yeah.
kind of controlling the way that women are represented,
Yeah,
through a group.
and why do you think that we don't, and by we I just mean everybody who writes textbooks and talks about this stuff, why do we not see women in the same light? Like even somebody like any of these people we've been talking about, you never hear about them, one, and two, you never hear them referred to as the same sort of genius as Picasso. Like Georgia O'Keeffe doesn't get that credit in the same way. Like we don't have pictures of her with her quotes on inspirational posters, um, where we do have Picasso in the same way.
Yeah. And I think
And I mean, this
I
goes
think
outside of the arts. You could say the same thing about like Marie Curie and Einstein.
yeah, that's true.
But why
Well,
do you have any insight as to why we don't see that?
so from I can kind of answer this sorry, I can answer this academically, which is
Go.
kind of boring. So I think academically speaking, again, thinking about our disciplines, the discipline of art history, the discipline of history, even like the disciplines of political science, the biology. A lot of times, again, the first people to really sit down and write those histories were men. And again, we're white
So you're
elite.
see so really the reason we see it is that the people wanted to see genius in themselves, essentially.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they're gonna present genius in a way that kind of mirrors who they are.
Yeah.
And maybe that's human. Is that a human? That might be human,
That I think that's a
right?
human thing. We always kind of put ourselves into everything.
We see the world as we are,
Yep.
right? We reflect the world back as we think it should be.
Yep.
But when it's written down,
Then that's the new facts.
it's the new facts, right? It's
Yeah.
it's got this power and agency. And I think it's one of the reasons why. Have you heard about these feminist Wikipedia projects?
Mm-mm.
So these will happen even at universities. I could set one up here at AUM or at ASU, where you'll have students um, sort of tackle a Wikipedia page
Oh
that
God.
has omitted or left out of the story women's history or African American history. So they'll go in and they'll do these what are I think they're called editathons or Wikipedia-athons, where people
Yeah.
will go in and using scholarship and lots of research, they'll actually, it's like historical revisionism, right? They're kind of
Yeah.
trying to revise these old histories that aren't really
Well,
accurate. There's just,
without all the negative connotations of historical
yes.
revisionism, yeah, that's
Yes,
kind of a
it's not
loaded term.
erasing. It's not yeah, it's not an erase and replace.
Yeah, it's an
It's
adding in
trying
of the appropriate links.
it's trying to be more holistic in our approach to writing history, to remembering history, that I think is important and can be very, very I think, very, very powerful as an exercise. And I think a lot of these women artists, certainly like someone like Judy Chicago, right,
Yeah.
with The Dinner Party,
Yeah.
that was her attempt as a visual artist to revise women's history. Now, she leaves out a lot of the other history and really focuses on women's history, but
Yeah.
sometimes
You get it done.
you got to get it done. You got to get the ball rolling. And so I think that's a first step at revising history. Yeah.
Yeah. Another note that I had was the push towards women to approach art as hobby and as amateurism, or as like to be a perpetual amateur.
That's something that's kind of, that's old.
But I can kind of but you can kind of even see it in culture today if you look at like what would be considered masculine hobbies. They're far closer to, they feel far closer to professional activity, even in the way that they're spoken about. Whether or not they are closer to professional activity is kind of irrelevant, but just the way that they're spoken about is so much different. It's odd.
I think if I just Googled etiquette books, ladies.
Oh dear.
Do you know how many things come up?
An ungodly number.
An ungodly number.
I wonder how many etiquette books are for men. Probably two. Two.
None? Two? Zero? Yeah. -2? I think... And as part of this, as part of like social etiquette,
it's probably some weird book on chivalry somewhere.
They do. They dictate that women should be able to paint. Women should be able to tinker on the piano and maybe sing a nice song. I.e., women should be able to do things that are entertaining. Indeed, painting is sort of better than playing music because it's quiet.
Yeah, and I was reading that the advantage of drawing over a musical activity is that it can be put down and immediately come back to in case something in the house needs to be done. And it's like, Jesus, if you want to talk about like almost defining your hobby by the fact you cannot do it seriously.
Yeah, but the idea that women should not be too skilled, too technically proficient, too talented at any one thing.
Yeah.
That was promoted starting in the 16th century. There are whole books about the 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th century.
Well, it's weird because then there's people like me who specifically just collect like random skills, and now you would refer to that as like being a Renaissance man, when in fact it sounds very much like that's what they were encouraging all these women to do. Collect just little bits of all these skills, but not too much of any one. Just lots of little ones. But I think
there was a fear, Wyndham, that they didn't want women to be too good at anything that was viewed as the man's prerogative or the man's realm, right?
Yeah, it's such a peculiar thing that we just don't. Because we have no reference, or we have. I shouldn't say we don't have any reference to it. We do. We still see it all the time, but we have such a light version of that thing.
Yes, but I think there was. I think there were just social expectations placed on women. Gosh, and again, they're still there, although, like you said, not as powerful. Or women can certainly negotiate life around those expectations, or at least they try to.
Yeah.
But I'm looking at one of my students handed me an advertisement from the magazine Housekeeping Monthly from 1955.
Oh, I bet that's amazing.
It's called The Good Wife's Guide.
I bet that's incredible.
And again, looking at all of this, like, yeah, there is no room for a woman to become a master painter in their daily chores.
Oh, no, of course not.
Because really your whole day is preparing the home.
Caretaking.
It's caretaking. It's caretaking. And that's 1955, right? You know, that's kind of the age of my grandmothers. And that's not new, right? That's something that was really there The Victorians had very specific ideas about women during. Again, go back to
Yeah,
Jane Austen.
probably
It's all
1500
there.
till now
Yeah.
was probably, or 1500 till probably 1980 was probably very similar, or mid 70s at least.
So I think what we sort of saying here is that, why have there been no great women artists? Because they just didn't have time in the day.
Yeah, it's not the
Because
time.
society wouldn't give them the time during the day.
Well, and remind me of the name of Marie Antoinette's portraitist.
Elizabeth Vigée Lebrun.
De Lebrun. How would she have navigated that? Would she was she just wealthy enough to have people to take care of that in her life, and so it just was not a problem, or did she have
Not
some other situation? Because you said
not
she was a mother,
necessarily.
right?
Not necessarily. Elizabeth Vigée Lebrun was not. She was not like a member of the nobility. She was not from the upper crust of French society by any means. And some sort of think of her as really the first professional artist. Um,
Interesting.
so she, like Artemisia Gentileschi, is this kind of, she's a bit of I don't want to say oddity, but her career is definitely different. It's very unusual for a woman of the day. And I think working for a consistent patron like Marie Antoinette, she was able to, maintain a very comfortable lifestyle. I'm trying to remember one of these female painters. Her husband did a lot of the housework and taking care of the children.
Oh, really?
I can't remember if it's
How spicy for the time period.
shame on me for forgetting about the husband, right?
Yeah, shame, shame, shame.
But even when Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI are sort of hauled off to prison and have their heads removed,
That's a nice way to put it.
Vigée Lebrun is able to again still maintain a career. So she does flee because she's very much associated with the monarchy.
Yeah.
So she's like, let's get out of France. She goes to Italy and she just trains and paints and
That's awesome.
she keeps on working even in a kind of exile. Yeah, but she's an interesting character, and I wish I knew a little bit more. I will say, if anyone is interested, there is a new film about Elizabeth Vigée Lebrun, a biopic it's on Amazon Prime. I have not watched it.
Oh.
It could be terrible.
Okay.
But I
But
was
exist.
very excited.
Okay, cool.
She is so important that she does get her own biographical movie. So that
Cool.
has to say
Well, I'll have to look that one up and watch that because she sounds awesome.
yes.
Or at least her life sounds awesome. The movie might be terrible.
It could be terrible, but maybe it'll be great.
Here's to hoping.
It's on my list for the next week or so.
Okay, well, whichever one of us watches it first, we'll let the other person know. So, coming into contemporary, and this might be outside of the wheelhouse that you've been stuck into with this class you've been teaching, but coming into contemporary times, let's say 1970s on. What trends are you seeing that are positive? Are there any that you see that are actually negative trends in rectifying this? What have you been seeing moving forward? Because there are people now that are probably just as famous as any other visual artist. There's people like was it Maria Abramovic? I'm probably butchering her name, but there's people like her that are just as well known as any male artist nowadays. How do you see that going? And again, if it's just outside of what you've been working on, you're welcome to not. Okay.
I have an answer for you.
Okay. Okay. So did you hear my question?
I did hear your question.
Okay. Awesome. Good.
And what I would say about second wave feminism and the emerging feminist art is it just opened up the possibilities for women.
Okay.
But you mentioned Marina Abramovic.
Yeah. Okay. Good. I didn't butcher her name too bad.
Performance art.
Yep.
It's something that men did. It's something that women artists really took to the next level. And I even think about someone like Yoko Ono. I think about Carolee Schneemann. I think about these women who went into spaces of traditional art, kind of hanging on walls, and essentially, I think, took back their bodies, redefined what art making could be. So I think with the 1970s,
and it's an interesting way to kind of be really, really, really in the space. Like to have a very powerful avatar in the space is to do performance art in a space that would normally just be paintings on a wall.
Exactly, and I think what's really great about sort of feminism and feminist art that there is no media that is not used.
Yeah.
They will use almost anything in art making, and they'll kind of go back to sort of traditional quote unquote crafts.
Yeah.
Like textiles and embroidery, and again there'll be this kind of sort of a taking back of those media.
Yeah, we're seeing that the quilt show at the museum.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was just I just did my lecture for my student yesterday on Faith Ringgold's story quilts.
Oh yeah, yep.
And her quilt about Aunt Jemima,
yep.
Right? And her kind of recasting of Aunt Jemima, who really a racist, stereotyped image, and sort of taking her and making her this sort of successful businesswoman with this accomplished family. So again, kind of using the quilt medium though as a way to tell stories. Again, I feel like with feminist art, photography also, I think, performance photography, traditional craft media, there is nothing that they won't utilize to create work that is political, that is powerful. I think, for me as a medievalist, one of the reasons why I gravitate towards feminist art or feminism opposed to, say, modernism, is because, oh my gosh, the art has function again.
Yeah.
I mean, what's going on? What's going on in the 60s? Minimalism. Kill me now. Minimalism. It's vacuumed, right? It says it's not about communicating. It's not about stories. It's the opposite. Yeah. And these feminist artists were like, I can't be a minimalist.
Yeah.
This isn't going to work for me.
Yeah, when you have stories to tell, you need to tell them.
Yeah, and certainly thinking, Black women artists, like Faith Ringgold or Betty Sarah, they're like, I had to go political. I had no choice.
Yeah.
Martin Luther King was assassinated. I had to create work that said something about this.
Yes.
They're like, minimalism? Give me a break. White cubes stacked on a wall? I mean, no. That's why I kind of, when it gets to the kind of 1970s and I could start talking about feminist art, even though it can make students uncomfortable or kind of challenge their ideas about what art is.
Yeah, but that's fun.
That's the fun. But I can also just, again, I like art that's about story. So and I think there is so much great work being put out by women, sort of coming up in my class. Do Kara Walker, we've got some Cindy Sherman, again, artists who are revising histories, and histories plural, and who are doing it sort of just unabashedly, and who are very successful.
Yeah.
In a world where success does not always come easy.
No.
Definitely not to women of color. So
no.
Good stuff coming.
Yeah, it's actually interesting thinking about that and just teaching in the place that we teach, and neither of us are from the South. Neither of us are from the deep South. And it's so interesting to watch our students make work, especially those that are really embracing narrative structure and more interesting topics, how they, especially the female ones, navigate all of that, how they bring in those narratives, and how you can see them doing what essentially the whole art world's doing in your class, which is nice.
It's always nice. And I think women artists, they have to be brave, right?
Oh yeah.
And they have to be willing to test all strategies and all problems. Way that we
and in a lot of these cases, the stories that are being told are so personal that like a lot of the feminist art that we've been talking about, the politics of it are not national politics; it's personal politics, and
exactly.
and that
the
does
politics of the body. It's body
yes,
politic, right?
correct.
And I think men can produce very personal work and very powerful work. That's not to sort of suggest that they don't do that, but I think the stakes are higher for women, and I think the potential for social criticism is.
Oh yes, and especially for specifically for our students in this area, the potential for social fallout is incredible.
It is. It is. Again, they have to be very brave.
Yes, and thank you to all of those who are brave with their work.
Yeah. I agree.
And then one more thing, just kind of to cap off contemporary production. How do you feel about androgynous and anonymous actors, people who and I mean actors as actors in the world, not actors in a movie. How do you feel about like anonymous artists that you don't know are male or female, and it's not apparent, and they make no mention? Do you think that's a positive thing or negative, or do you think it's taking away from the story? How do you feel about that?
I think it would. I think it would. I can tell you how I think. What I think about that.
Yeah,
I think
go. Yeah.
You would get wildly different answers.
Oh yes.
Like if you ask Judy Chicago, I kind of know what maybe Judy Chicago would say. If you were to ask someone like Nan Golden, she would say the opposite of what Judy Chicago would say.
Yes.
My feeling is that when it comes to gender, right? Gender, we've all decided this. I hope that it's a social construct.
Yeah.
It's like a cultural construct.
Yeah.
And so my feeling is that, again, it's about being brave and just being true to who you are. And you can define your gender, but if you don't want it to define it, or if you don't want to let the world define it for you, I have no issue with it.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think, again, feminism at its core, right, is about just equality. Mm-hmm. That's the idea. Whether, again, it can be very extreme forms of feminism, more moderate, but that's all it is. The message to me has always been equal rights for everybody, regardless of gender or sexual orientation, whatever, the long list of things. And so in that regard, I don't need an artist, an image maker to define their gender.
All right.
I don't, again, just like George O'Keeffe said, should gender be used as a way we evaluate or define someone's work?
Yeah.
No, probably not.
Yep.
It's limited. Yeah, again, those binaries, right? Masculine, male, female. They don't necessarily they don't accurately reflect the work we're looking at, or do they really reflect?
Yeah. All right. Well, that's fantastic. I think that's a really good point to end on. That was a great conversation. Thank you for joining me this morning.
Thank you.
Yeah, and have a lovely rest of this strange semester being a teacher. And I'll try to get I'll try to get that video together and up, and I'll send you the link.
All right. Thank you so much.
All right. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Bye.